We go to the next session on clinical trial in the European Union, and I leave the floor to my colleague Fergus Sweeney to moderate the session.
So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this session, which is about clinical trials in the European Union, but also then about transparency of information on clinical data as well. So different elements of the process, both from the beginning and the end, once we have the results, both of which are important to all of you, and I think it's very good to understand those processes. So it's a great pleasure to welcome first Dr. Karl Broich. Karl Broich is president of BfArM, so one of our largest medicines regulators in the EU. But he also brings to that his origins and qualification in neurology and psychiatry, still leading on the scientific side in our CRS working group, and also in a different aspect, bringing his leadership as chair of the EU Telematics Management Board, which helps to guide us as regulators through the development of the various informatics systems that we need to support our work, but also to support many of you in your work as well. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Karl and give you the floor. I've discussed with both speakers and we'll take questions after both speakers. I understand there's a lot of questions, so please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Fergus, for the kind introduction. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here and to provide to you some update on the clinical trials legislation coming up and which have to be implemented, and to combine here a little bit the centralized view of the EMA and the view by a national competent authority as well. What I like to discuss with you today is there will be a new legislation which has been published, but we are waiting for the implementation. And you will see this has something to do with the portal and the database program. And there are current and future challenges for all national competent authorities, and many of the aspects you discussed earlier today will fall into place. So, for instance, interaction with ethical committees and so on. So the clinical trial regulation has changed over time in Europe, and you know all, before 2004, this was completely organized on the national level. National rules with all the different processes throughout Europe made this system very complicated, particularly for sponsors from industry, but for academia as well, because multinational trials have been a real hurdle. Then the directive 2001-20 came out, and as a first step to harmonize these processes. However, there has been a real outcry, particularly on the side of academia, how complicated the system is, how bureaucratic the system is. And I think after all the years, we learned from each other that the system profited at all sides involved. So the first step for e-applications have been done in this system, and we are already today working in the system, and based on the pressure to do multinational trials, we implemented the voluntary harmonization procedure, particularly for clinical trials. And this experience from these systems together with the decentralized procedures for drug approval have been now implemented then in the new legislation regarding clinical trials coming up. So there is our intention to harmonize even further in a combined assessment for multinational trials, so that there is one reference member state doing much of the work, and for the concerned member states involved. And then we are moving now to a full electronic submission and trial system then in the future. So most of you will be aware that a directive has to be implemented in the national laws. This was the case with the current legislation. Regulation is directly applicable in the member states, and so as already mentioned, so with the directive that was a first step towards more harmonization in Europe. However, still national specialties have to be taken into consideration. This system is not easy to manage. There has been a lack of harmonization between the member states. This hampers multinational trials. And of course, a typical example is that in some member states, recruiting is already ongoing. For that country, recruited might be even closed when other member states are start with their recruitment. So this is very difficult then for the implementation of clinical trials and for the interpretation then in the end as well. So we have introduced, therefore, these voluntary harmonized procedures, which have been taken now into account for the new clinical trial regulations. So the first step is to harmonize even further, and the other thing is we learned we have to foster innovation. We have to be faster, so there are high unmet medical needs. So the system has to address this, that clinical trials can be performed faster in a harmonized way throughout Europe. And even then, we all know about the multinational travel clinical trials, not only in Europe, but in the US and other areas of the world as well. And there is a lot of competition. And our interest in the end that Europe stays as one of the very attractive areas for research and development, particularly for medicinal products and biologicals. So on the one hand, we are trying to simplify the clinical trial application process, particularly for the multinational trials, with new IT technologies and coordinated reviews. On the other hand, there is a broad need for more transparency, which clinical trials are underway. Patients are looking for clinical trials where they might enter or are interested to enter in these clinical trials. And we all know the criticism then on our system with a publication bias, that there is no transparency, that only positive clinical trials have a chance to be published, that the negative outcomes are not published or not visible enough to patients and the public. And I think with the new legislation in place, we try to address all these problems. What is in scope of the clinical trial regulation? So all interventional clinical trials, so if there is a randomization of a patient to a treatment strategy, then this is an interventional clinical trial and has to be then acknowledged by a regulatory agency. Low intervention clinical trials for authorized products, and particularly if there is a minimal additional risk or burden for the patient, then due to safety reasons of the subjects, you have to go for this procedure. Not in scope are the non-interventional trials, as for instance, observational studies and trials without medicinal products. So, for instance, in the last year, we very often did have requests at our agency for oxytocin to study this as a challenge agent than, for instance, in psychiatric clinical trials. So this is not in the scope of the legislation. If it is a treatment for aggressive behavior, then it would be in scope as a clinical trial. We have to look at. So what are the key changes from the directive to the new regulation? So of course, the fundamental good clinical practice principles will stay and will be still implemented. However, we are moving to a clearly more risk-based approach. So, and this is what our experts in the assessment of a clinical trial will do. They are looking not, is this the best treatment, or is the statistical procedure perfect until the end? So what we are trying to do is, in a risk-based approach, if there is a patient safe in this treatment and in this clinical trial, and this is the most important thing. Therefore, simplifying for these safety reporting requirements is an essential in the regulation. Supervision of clinical trials with controls in the member states and third countries, inspections should be better coordinated so that we have signals earlier when they come up. And this is particularly important if we are looking to the new clinical trials upcoming, for instance, in oncology, if we think on platform trials, umbrella approaches, basket trials, so short clinical trials, so based on only on a few patients. So here we are really in a difficult situation, and we have to address this. The concept of co-sponsorship is now addressed in the legislation. Informed consent has been clarified, and one important thing before the next step can be done is the establishment of the EU portal and EU database. And already you will be well aware of the UDRA-CT database, and however, there are clear limitations with this database, and so we are hard working on the new EU portal and database within the telematics boards of the EMA and the national competent authorities, and it's one of the reasons that it is so difficult to establish that the regulation is somehow delayed, which is already known to you. One important thing is that one e-submission now will provide a harmonized dossier to all involved member states. So it's one trial, one e-submission of structured data, very easy then to document and to look for. However, the idea is we have two parts. Part one will be done by the reference member state doing the most of the work, and then a part two will be done by all concerned member states as well. So there is a distribution of the burden among the users. No longer every member state has to do the whole work, and I think this is one of the most important things, particularly for academia as well. So the authorization process looks like this. So there will be a submission to all member states via this new EU portal. Then a reference member state will be determined. He has to validate that this application is okay, has all information available which is needed. And then they start a joint assessment, part one. So which type of clinical trial is it? Very superficial benefit risk assessment. So at this stage, there is clearly no pre-assessment of a later dossier submitted for approval. So is the investigator's brochure correct? Are the assessment reports clearly foreseen? And what will be done? Then in the part 2, every member state concerned with for the clinical trial has to look for his national specialties, recruitment activities, are there biobanks, special centers available, and so on. Key is we have very, very short timelines available for the sponsors, for us as regulators. So if there is a tacit approval foreseen, if nobody reacts in time, so this is really a challenge for us at the regulatory level. So the most important will be the reporting member state. I told you we have some experience with this from the decentralized approval procedure and the VHP procedures in clinical trials. The ethical committees, their composition, role, and decision remains a national decision. We have to take that into account. And there is a possibility to disagree with Part 1 conclusions by the reference member state. However, there are limitations. So, and a refusal can be done only if Part 1 or Part 2 are both negative, or if a national ethical committee has issued a negative opinion for that member state. So then the clinical trial can't be done in that member state. What we see sometimes is that a new clinical trial has been approved by our experts, but the clinical trial doesn't start. So there is now a clear rule. If you don't have the first patient recruited within 2 years, then your application has failed and you have to start again with the process. Key in the new legislation, as I did explain, is the new EU portal and the EU database. So all submissions, including all documents, will go through this EU portal. And every trial-related communication between sponsor, a reference member state, and the concerned member states will be done within this IT framework. And this is very complicated to make that over the time that every signal is found, documented, and adequately put there. And what we learn now is, having seen the first versions for the user acceptance testing, that in principle we have built the system, but it's a little bit slowly. It's a little bit complicated if you are doing, or if you have to manage very many clinical trials. And for instance, we as BfArM are overlooking, after the FDA worldwide, this second place clinical trials. So we see 900 to 1,000 clinical trials a year. So without a clear IT structure where we can combine the new portal and our existing IT system, then in Germany would not be possible for us. Then we would be stuck every day. So this is a pre-requirement before the new regulation can go into place. And so here we are now in a stepwise software development, the second column. So we are preparing now for the independent audit next year. So one big step will be done next year, and hopefully this will be successful. And after this audit report comes back to the management board of EMA and is accepted there, then the Commission can publish then in the official journal that the regulation comes now into place. And then 6 months later, it becomes applicable with a 3-year transition period. So, as I told you, there is a difference in the member state field within the European Union. There are countries with many clinical trials. There are countries which a lower number of clinical trials, and of course the interests are a little bit different. So the portal will include an interface to the member states' IT systems, and this interface now will be part of this important audit next year, so that we can be sure the functionalities will be there. And what we are trying is now, time is one important step in this, so that the new regulation comes into place. However, much more important is that the system is working then in the end for academia, for sponsors from industry, and for us as regulators as well. And so that has our highest priority, that all the functionalities have been implemented. So it would be worse if we are going from now somehow working system to a very complicated not working system. So here the aim stays harmonization. It should be not that complicated for these multinational trials. This is highest key. So 3-year transition period after the publishing from the European Commission. Then in the first year thereafter, the sponsors from academia or industry can decide, are they going with the old system or the new system? After the second year, you have to start with the new system, and the latest is after 3 years of implementation, you have to switch with your clinical trials to the new system anyway, so there is no way around then. So I mentioned the short deadlines. If we don't manage that, then there is a tacit approval, and the sponsors can go ahead. So everybody is working hard to avoid this situation, so to be on the safe side. These short timelines can be even shorter. For instance, when with the starting procedure, there's some difficulties with the reference member state elected by the sponsor, by industry. If other concerned member states have a problem with that, then there will be a longer validation phase for even to apply the reference member state, and it could be that only 3 days for the full validation of the application are left. So this is really a challenge. So if the member states fail to comply with the deadline, in most cases a tacit approval will result. If the sponsor failed to comply, then the application lapsed in all member states. So it's a big thing for both sides. Still, we have these interaction with the ethical committees. This will be on the national level. Currently, in most member states, so the current system is, or looks like Peter framed it this morning earlier, that ethical committees work completely independent from the regulatory agencies. And we have to deal with that in the future better. And so some member states did have pilot projects to foster a better interaction between the ethical committees and our regulatory bodies. And I will come back to that with the German example. Simple to show you, if there is a clinical trial application without any issue, then the application might be granted within 60 days. If there is a request for additional information, then these time will increase, for instance, to 75 days at a maximum with a validation issue. If we request further information, it might go to 91 days. But as you can see, after 3 to 4 months, every application has to be decided. And this is a real improvement to the old system. And for instance, in Germany, we developed such a pilot project with ethical committees together. So 35 of the 15 German ethical committees agreed to take part since 2016. And we used the new timelines, the new new legislation to monitor and to assess these clinical trial applications. 81 have been assessed, and in nearly all cases but 2, we have been able to hold these deadlines. So the system can work, and in no case there was a disagreement between the ethical committee and the regulatory agency in the end. So I think we are very happy about this outcome. So in conclusion, the impact of the clinical trial regulation should be a better harmonization throughout Europe, but even in then broader multinational applications. It's a single dossier, single submission approach electronically. There will be one single opinion in the end, so for all member states involved. And so the facilitation of multi-state clinical trials will be much easier than it has been done up to today. The new challenges mentioned are these complex clinical trials coming up. So one of the experience is that we get clinical trial applications from sponsors as a platform. And then we see such one study protocol where we have seen in earlier times 6, 7, or 8 applications. So, and this, to do that with all these short timelines might be challenging in some instances. And here we have to check how we can deal with these things. Some of the aspects are charming of these complex study designs, but there are, on the other hand, risks as well for the whole system. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carl. So, as I said, we'll hold questions and the discussion till after our second presentation. So it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Karen Quigley. Karen has a degree in pharmacy from Trinity College Dublin, my own alma mater, so it's a great pleasure to welcome you. PhD from University of London, and has been with the EMA for 15 years now after working for Council of Europe and for the HPRA, the Irish Medicines Agency, and has worked in quite a range of services within the agency, so has a lot of experience, but is currently working with the clinical data publication team and what many of you may know as Policy 70, so she will describe that and some additional aspects of our transparency to us. So please, Karen.
Okay, thank you, Fergus. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to talk to you this afternoon to give you an overview of transparency in relation to clinical data, and hopefully to also communicate to you why transparency is important to us here at the agency. We strive to be as open as possible about how we work and how we reach regulatory decisions. And in terms of transparency, there is a legal framework, but while the agency complies with that legal framework, we also try to exceed that where possible. And the most recent example of that is the Policy 70, which I will discuss on a later slide. So the 4 main areas in terms of transparency that I wanted to address this afternoon are, the first one is the public assessment reports, the EPARs, and unfortunately, like everything else here at the agency, we use a lot of abbreviations and refer to things in a very short way. So we have the access to documents is the second one, or the ATD. The clinical data publication, which is also known as the Policy 70, which is our most recent one, and the clinical trial regulation, which the directive, and now we have the new regulation. So, and we've heard quite a lot about that in our previous presentation as well, but I will talk about the transparency aspects of that. So here we have a brief summary of the differences between the different policies and that we have here at the agency. So the first one is the access to documents policy, and that is based on a regulation, which is 1043, which talks about public access to documents that are held here at the agency. And I will go into each of these in more detail. And so this is related to any document that's held at the agency and it's on request. So this is a request that's made by an individual and the documents are given to an individual. So it's a case-by-case process. In terms of the clinical data publication policy, this is also policy 70, these are the clinical reports on which the marketing authorizations are based. And these are proactively published since the policy came into play in 2015, and they're published on our portal on the website. And then in the clinical trial regulation, we have the register, which is published on our website, and that's proactively. And we have heard also in the previous presentation about how the transparency requirements will be increased with the new EU portal and the new EU database under the new regulation. So the first area that I'm going to address is the EPARs, and so this falls under the Regulation 726/2004, which is the regulation which governs the authorisation and supervision of medicinal products here at the agency. And within that regulation, it talks about that the opinion of the committee should be made publicly accessible. So there is a transparency requirement in there. And so this applies to all opinions that are given by the Human Committee, the CHMP, and also the Veterinary Committee. But it also applies to withdrawals and refusals. So any product that was withdrawn in the first, in the assessment of the 210-day cycle, which I'm sure you've heard about this morning, and also any product that receives a negative outcome, the assessment report is also published for that. We publish the assessment report at the end of the procedure with the deletion of all commercially confidential information. The European Public Assessment Report also includes a summary that's written in a manner that's understandable for the public, and this is a requirement of the Regulation 726. So this is where we have a summary for the public which contains questions like what is this medicine used for, how has my medicine been studied, and so this is available for each medicine that's authorised here through the centralised procedure. And these summaries for the public are generated by our medical writer team, so we have a very experienced team of people here at the agency who write these summaries for us. These summaries are available, as I say, on our website for each product. The product information, which is a summary of product characteristics, is also available, and both of those are available in all of the EU languages. And then the CHMP assessment report is published on the website also at the same time, once the Commission decision has been issued for a particular product. So then moving on to the second aspect that I wanted to talk about in terms of the transparency is the access to documents policy. And this, as I say, falls under the Regulation 1049, 2001. And this regulation talks about public access to documents. And this public access governs all documents from the European Parliament, the European Council, the European Commission, and it also applies to documents held here at the agency. So in terms of compliance with this, we have a policy in place, which is also called Policy 43, which is published on our website. And we also have a guide on how to do this. And you have the link to the guide here on the bottom of this slide. So if you wish to request a document, and these are documents that are, it's important to say that both produced by the agency, so in terms of an assessment report, but it also includes documents that are provided to the agency from a third party, so that somebody who sends us a document, that can also be requested if it's held by the agency. In terms of requesting the document, you have a link here to the web form, so we ask some details, so you need to complete that, some basic background information about who you are, what type of document you're requesting, and then this is acknowledged in receipt here at the agency, and there's a 15-day turnaround time in order to locate that document and provide it to the requester. One of the issues that we have with this policy is that often we have requests that are not very clear. Somebody, for example, gives the name of a medicinal product and says all documents relating to this would be huge. Maybe they have misunderstood terminology that we use in various different ways in how we refer, for example, to different types of assessment reports. And so sometimes we may need to clarify with an applicant what exactly is the document that they're requesting so that we can locate the exact document that they wish to receive. So if it's a document where there's a third party involved, of course, we consult with them, and the commercially confidential information is redacted through those documents before they're released to an individual. And so those have a copyright on them, and so that they are, as I say, it's not a proactive public release, it's just to one individual person. So to give you an overview in terms of numbers, then in terms of the number of requests that are received under this policy. So in 2017, we had over 840 requests. So this is the graph on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, for the last number of years, we have the pages and documents which are released. And again, in 2017, we see that there was over 2,800 documents released and over 487,000 pages released. So it's quite a lot of work, and we have a team of people who are working constantly on access to documents policy here at the agency. Moving to our third one, where I'm going to spend a little bit more time because it's our newer policy, is the clinical data publication policy. And so this is a policy which doesn't have a legal basis as such, apart from the general transparency requirements under the EU legislation. And so this policy was adopted by our management board here at the agency in October 2014 and came into effect in January of 2015 for new marketing authorizations submitted after that date. So this was in response to a demand from the public that we publish the clinical data on which the regulatory decisions are based. So there's been increasing demand throughout the EU saying, you know, can we have more data on which these decisions are based? Prior to this, of course, we published the EPAR, but this is just the assessment, so it's not the actual clinical study reports on which the decisions have been reached. So the benefits of this policy are increasing the transparency that we are committed to here at the agency, and so it enables public scrutiny of the decisions that have been reached. And it also can avoid the duplication of clinical trials and enhances scientific knowledge and will allow secondary assessment of these as more are published. So I think I've covered maybe quite a lot of this slide already in terms of when the policy came into effect. It covers, as I say, since January 2015, marketing authorizations for new applications submitted on or after that date, which would have come to opinion at the earliest in September of 2015. And it also includes withdrawn applications and applications which receive a negative opinion. So we published the clinical data for all of those. And from July 2015, it was for extension of indications for products also covers those. So what type of documents then do we publish in the clinical data publication policy? So we publish, you see here on the standard pictogram that for the common technical document from modules 1 to 5. And so for the clinical data publication, we publish module 2.5, the clinical overview, modules 271 to 274, the clinical summaries, and we publish module 5.3, the clinical study reports that are included in the marketing authorization application that's been received here. And we also include just the body of the report and just 3 of the appendices, so the protocol, the sample case report form, and the statistical analysis methods. So currently, we're in what we call phase 1 of the policy, and we don't publish any individual patient data listings, but that's considered that will fall in the second phase of the policy, and we don't have a date for implementation of the second phase yet. So this slide covers our guidance, and we have very extensive guidance on Policy 70 for those of you that are interested in more of the detail of it. And this is a document which is over 100 pages, divided into various different chapters. So we have the introduction, the scope, the definitions for the policy. We have a second chapter on the procedural aspects, and this is primarily about how the procedure is run for those stakeholders that are submitting applications under Policy 70 for their clinical data. There is a chapter on commercially confidential information, how to identify commercially confidential information and how it should be redacted within your documents. And then there's a separate chapter on anonymisation of clinical reports, what methodologies could be chosen, how to document the process, the risk assessment that's conducted, and how to protect the individual, the patient data. And so this document is published on our website, and it's been most recently revised at the end of last year. So then to look a little bit more detail about what is commercially confidential information. So the agency proactively publishes the documentation. And of course, we do protect commercially confidential information where it's been identified. But we have a lot of cases where applicants will propose text as commercially confidential. And there is an assessment process here, both under the access to documents policy and under the clinical data publication policy, to determine if the information is really commercially confidential in line with the guidance that we have in place. So the agency does not accept redaction of information as commercially confidential if it's already available in the public domain. And you'll be surprised about the amount of information that we receive proposed as commercially confidential that is actually in the public domain, that it's already been published, for example, on the EPAR, or is available widely in scientific literature, has been published as study results from the particular company, for example. We don't consider CCI, also if it doesn't bear any innovative features, if it's considered common knowledge. So it's widely known in scientific community, for example, that assay method is widely used, or if the justification that's been provided is irrelevant. So we often get justifications that are not specific or pertinent to the information that's been proposed to be redacted. And also, we don't accept it if no commercial harm, if it's not explained or if it's insufficiently explained how this would injure the commercial rights of the proposer. So in terms of the anonymisation process, so the agency is committed to protecting the personal data of individuals, and we don't wish to publish data which would harm or release anybody's personal data. So anonymisation here is the process of turning data into a form that does not identify any individual and where the identification is not likely to take place. So we try to ensure that there's a very low risk of re-identification of an individual. And with the documents that we publish, that I've outlined on the previous slide, we also publish an anonymisation report, which is prepared by the industry, by the stakeholder. And so within this anonymisation report, they detail the process of how they've anonymised their data, what methodology that they've chosen, and what the impact of the anonymisation is on data utility. And this is a very detailed area, so I haven't gone into very much detail in this slide, but again, this is covered in the guidance. But one of the points that I would say is the impact of anonymisation on data utility is a very important point, because if the document is heavily redacted, there's not a lot of value in the agency publishing this if nothing can be read from it, because it's so heavily redacted and it cannot be used, for example, in a secondary analysis. So it's very important for us that we look at the impact of that on how the data can be used. So in terms of clinical data publication, as I say, it's a very recent policy here at the agency. So we've had the first year's data came to an end in October 2017. So it ran from October 2016 was the first publication of clinical data here. And so in the first year, we had 54 procedures published, 36 for initial marketing authorizations and 18 for extension of indications. And in terms of the documents published, we had over 3,000 documents published and over 1.3 million pages were released under this policy. And as with any new policy, there is a learning curve and there is a bedding in process. And so we would see that the numbers will be increasing as time goes on. And it's also maybe worth saying here that in terms of what we publish, we don't select what we publish. We don't select, for example, more innovative products for publication first. We publish in chronological order of the CHMP opinion dates. So it's strictly follows that order. So in terms of the clinical data publication policy, we also have a lot of international collaboration, and I thought it was worth sharing with you because I know that a lot of you are coming from different agencies and have different experiences. And so this agency has been the first to publish this type of clinical data, but we're also sharing the work that we're doing and the experience with our colleagues from Health Canada, for example, for FDA, and with our colleagues in Japan. We've recently had a colleague here for 5 months working with us in the CDP team. So we look at how we can harmonise, because we realise that many of these dossiers are the same that are being submitted in multiple jurisdictions. And we are they're looking at what we do, and we're looking at what they do in the area of transparency. And this is an ongoing dialogue that we have, and sharing, updates via bilaterals and so on. So then coming to the clinical trial transparency, the fourth aspect of this transparency presentation, we know that we've heard the presentation from Carl earlier, and we know that prior to 2004 and the implementation of the directive on clinical trials, it was quite a different picture in the member states. There was an individual authorizations through member states. It was different processes. It was not a very harmonized, especially where you had to have individual clinical trial applications made to different member states where you were trying to run a multi-state it hampered sort of multi-state clinical trial being conducted. And so in order to increase the harmonisation, we have the directive, and now we have the regulation coming into force, which will also increase transparency. So some of the questions that have been raised in terms of clinical trial transparency were, have all clinical trials been publicly registered? So how would you find information as if there's a clinical trial in which you wanted to participate? If you participated in a trial, was the outcome recorded? How would you know that, or how would you get that information? So what would you know about the medicine that you're taking? So have other trials of a similar nature have already been conducted? So in order to provide that sort of information, but also to strike the right balance between informing the public and protecting public health, we have published on the EMA website the register of clinical trials. And of course, this data will be increasing with the new regulation once this comes into force. But here I presented a snapshot of the clinical trial register, and this has been published on our website since 2004. And this covers interventional clinical trials that are conducted in the EU or the EEA, and clinical trials that are conducted outside the EU EEA that are linked to European paediatric products development. And so then we have sort of, to give you an overview of the numbers of trials that are published. I mean, there's, since this is from 10 days ago, I think that this information was taken from our website, so it's increasing all the time. But the number that was currently over 31,000 clinical trials with a UDRA-CT protocol, and over 5,000 of those were for patients less than 18 years of age. And over 9,700 trials have been registered, have been conducted in the EU, now have the results posted within this register. So this information is all available. And on the next slide, I've given you a snapshot of, this is just an example, it's quite small writing, but hopefully when you get the slides you can see the sort of information that's published there. And this is just an example from Metformin. And so this gives you the summary results that you can have access to, the protocol, the type of trial, the sponsor, the investigational medicinal product, the therapeutic area that's covered, whether the trial is ongoing or it's completed. So there's a lot of information there, and the amount of information that will be published, as I say, will only increase with the new regulation. So here we have in summary the different the clinical trials that are authorised in the EU EEA, and so there's a growing amount of information that is being published since 2004. So we have the protocol and the results published for phase 2, 3 and 4 trials in adults since 2004, and for phase 1 to 4 paediatric trials. So again, as I say, the transparency levels are only increasing with the new regulation, and we've had a delay, shall we say, in terms of the EU portal, but it's the amount of information that will be provided in there, I think, will be a big improvement for the public. So in terms of conclusions then, so the agency has launched these various different initiatives in order to increase transparency. So I think we've just had an overview of 4 different areas, and so they're both available on request and proactively. And so with this increase in transparency, we hope to avoid the duplication of clinical trials and to increase public trust and confidence in the EMA's scientific and decision-making processes. And this will be, for example, with increasing publication of the clinical data with the information that's on which the decision-making process for a marketing authorization is reached with the publication in the EPAR. And this data all enables public scrutiny, while at the same time striking that important balance of protecting the confidential information and protecting personal data. So in terms of concluding, I'd just like to say that the agency is committed to making transparency key to all of the work that we do, and to making public the data and information about medicines, their development and authorization, in order to generate trust so that the information is available, to build confidence so that people have confidence in the data that's being assessed and knowing what that data is, and it will empower in terms of the knowledge will enable the decision making. So thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much to both our speakers, and I'd like to open the floor now for questions. please, lady on the right.
Yeah, hello, this is Anne Mathilde Kvamme from Haukeland University Hospital in Norway, and I have two issues. In academic studies today, our investigators complete the UDRA-CT application themselves, and they struggle. Will it at all be feasible for them to do it themselves in a new portal, or do we have to set up a system to help them out? That's question one, because I know the university hospitals in Norway have different approaches. And also, it's completing the result part. It's not very flexible, and investigators have given up, given all the new requirements. We tried to just upload some publications. When they couldn't do that because they have to give all the details, they said, well, don't worry about it, we don't do it. So is there any chance that there can be some flexibility for academic studies so we get these results into the database? Otherwise, we can't force them to do it, and they won't be there.
Okay, well, I think, and Carl may want to contribute as well, but we'll work closely with sponsors to provide training, and we have, although as has been indicated, there's been some interim issues with launching the system, but we will provide detailed training. We have quite detailed plans to have, for instance, short YouTube videos, processes for train the trainer, so we can train key trainers from different member states and work closely with national competent authorities so that they can also participate in that. Clearly, we want to have a system which is straightforward and intuitive, but at the same time, it is giving the opportunity, well, more than an opportunity, it's the application both for the permission to conduct the clinical trial from the authority and from the ethics committee. And there are a range of data and documents that do have to be supplied for that purpose. So it does need a little time, but it hopefully will be reasonably straightforward and we're able to provide training. For the flexibility, perhaps that's something we can discuss outside. I'm not quite sure what's intended, but the structure of results that we provide is closely harmonized with what is also used by clinicaltrial.gov. And is intended, as far as it's a very diverse world, clinical trials, but at the same time, we need to be able to provide a systematic, structured set of data, which has been carefully thought through and I think used on both sides of the Atlantic. So hopefully it can work. If you have queries about that, we'll try and deal with them. And certainly, I think perhaps support with additional training is something we could address also with the results. I don't know if you want to add to that, Carl.
Yeah, I think as explained, so key will be for us the functionality of the system. So that is the reason that not only the regulators are testing now deeply into the developed system, but sponsors from academia and industry as well. So that, of course, if the system is not acceptable or not feasible, then it will not be used. And so time is not the most important part here. So so that is the reason that we are invited then user testers to test and to be involved in these activities here at EMA. EMA is there very cooperative. So it's a learning system, and I'm pretty sure that we will reach then a functional system.
Thank you. Donna Kusemerera from the National Drug Authority in Uganda. My question is to Professor Carl. I wanted to find out, to hear a little bit more about the ethics committees and the clinical trials you said are working together to give a single opinion and on a clinical trial application. And I wanted to ask you to elaborate a bit more on that and whether there are any challenges that that joint process has faced. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this important question. So even in Germany, we made the experience that it depends for sponsors where they are located or where they are asking for the ethical vote. And there are some very critical ethical committees in Germany, and there are more liberal ethical committees. However, what we have done over the last years, that we have now a permanent work share program. So with these 35 ethical committees, we are have meetings on a regular basis discussing difficult applications or the ethically difficult applications to find some standards and to find there some harmonization as well. And that was a big surprise to us. So we have critical ethical committees within these 35 ethical committees and we have been able to harmonize the views so that in the end for these 81 pilot applications, it worked out very well. And I think that is a procedure we have to establish then throughout Europe so that there are a harmonization process. We have on our regulatory side that the ethical standards for Europe are harmonized a little bit as well. And I think we have shown that this is possible.
Hi, my name is Mariana Santos from UNDP. I have a quick question to Karen, actually two quick questions. Regarding the policy on clinical trials transparency, the policy 17. First question is, as far as I understood, all the clinical trials are published proactively and by chronologic order since they get scientific opinion from CHMP. My question is there any sort of exception for not to publish clinical trials? Is there any exception that you already faced where you couldn't publish for some reason? So just to understand if there is a chance for a company to say that they don't want to publish, or just to understand the exceptions that we can face, basically. And the second question is, since you get a scientific opinion from the CHMP, more or less, the time, an average of the time that it takes for the EMA to publish those clinical trials. And I'm sorry if I missed this information from the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, no, thank you for your question. No, there aren't any exceptions at the moment to where we publish. I don't know how closely you follow the policy, but you may know that the policy, as I said, came into force in the 1st of January 2015, and that was for applications submitted after that date. So the first opinions of the CHMP started in September, and the first publication started in October of 2016. So there was a gap before the policy sort of became up and running, shall we say, in terms of processing them here at the agency. So we're not currently up to speed with the CHMP opinions, for example, from last month. So, but we are publishing CHMP opinions from 2016, 2017, and so on in chronological order, and there are no exceptions. There is a possibility of non-compliance, and that's written into the policy, and it's also, we have a website, the EU portal, and there is a non-compliance part there, and as you will see that there is no non-compliance with the policy at the moment. And sorry, I've forgotten your second question.
Thank you. That's clear. My second question is about the duration,
yes,
or so the time in average. That
yes, the time between, that's what I was trying to explain, is what we have this sort of backlog at the moment. So what we're doing at the moment is we have a procedure whereby we send invitation letters to applicants who are concerned by this policy. So we give them 6 months' notice in which to prepare their packages, but they can also tell in terms of an individual company from where we are in terms of the CHMP opinions, because the overall opinion dates are known to a company, so they know where we are in terms of publication of other packages. But we do approach each company individually at minimum 6 months in advance, and also offer them additional support in terms of their first package in preparing for publication.
Thank you. I had a question on the left here. I don't know who had there. I think I can take one or two more. Okay. Sorry,
we can go a little beyond because the presentation were long, so we need the time for discussion.
Okay, Michela Gabaldo, Fondazione Teleton. My question is in relation to the regulation for access to document. I have actually a couple of questions. So the first one is, I understand the principle for which this regulation is implementing the principle of transparency, but the point is that why the transparency is included only in a single way, in the sense that whoever will need to make a request to EMA is then protected in the identity on the content. We have an example where we have been requested to check for eventual reduction of the commercial confidential information, but we don't know who have requested to have access to this document. So I think that in terms of transparency, we should know, this. And the second one is which kind of document. I've seen from your slide that according to this regulation, you can request access to document also during the development, so not only after the registration of the product. So I'm wondering which kind of document a company could request during the development. So if it is only the orphan drug designation, the PIP, so the formal procedure, or I'm more concerned about all the protocol assisted or scientific advice.
In relation to your first question, yes, of identifying who the requester is, that's a discussion that we're having at the moment. So when we have a member of the public, for example, that approaches the agency under the access to documents policy and says, can I have access to, for example, this assessment report? Then we may consult with the company whose assessment report this relates to, and they may ask who the requester is. If the requester is willing to reveal their name, at the moment we do release it. If the requester is not, we don't. But that is something that we're having active discussions on at the moment. So that may change. There may be an automatic release, but at the moment we don't release if the requester is not willing to give their details.
So of transparency, maybe, it should work on both ways.
Maybe I can intervene here. I think the principle of the regulation on transparency that we should release documents, but we have at the same time legislation telling us that certain elements are commercially confidential, trade secrets or manufacturing processes, and information that is innovative and belongs to the company, and that we are not allowed to release. So depending on where you are in the development, we will be able to release some information, but not everything. Of course, one of the big requesters is industry, trying to know what the others are doing. And in that case, when the information is still confidential, we don't release it. Many requesters are academics. They want to understand the data because they want to reanalyze, put them in perspective with other data. Then we also look at that. But depending on the stage of development, we have some rules that we can or cannot release. And that's why even in the clinical trial report, after approval, we are still looking for other type of information that remains commercially confidential.
I'm a bit worried about the transparency issue because it's a knife with two edges. I fully agree that for me it would be very interesting to see all these data and in quite some detail. However, as you know, I'm working in the field of vaccines, and what is very peculiar for the vaccines is that there is a group of people against vaccines, and they do everything what they can do, lie, the anti-vaccine lobby, and they will have probably also access to these kind of data, and they will misuse them. They will try to do whatever they can to make it a joke, yeah. How is EMA going to do with that? I can tell you, not so long ago, they published an article in a peer-reviewed journal where they made 12 mistakes against pharmacovigilance. It was pure bullshit, yeah? But they got it published. So what is going to happen if EMA gives them the access to the data, they make a fuss out of it, completely turn it around and get it published? Are you going to react?
So I don't know, Carol, do you want to make a comment, or then I will?
I think we did have a long discussion at the management board exactly on these issues, but I think there is no way around it. So if we like to be transparent, we have to publish these data and make them available. Of course, this is a scientific disputation then between us, and we all know that some of these vaccine enemies are very aggressive. They are torturing the clinical data. We all know that, but I think that's our job as regulators as well. You are right. We have to react and to make that clear to the public that they are wrong.
Thanks, Carl. And I would just add also that it's, as in Karen's last slide, transparency is about building confidence and trust in the public, and hiding information is not going to achieve that. We have to make the information available, but then articulate its meaning. And as you and Carla both rightly said, challenge misinterpretation and make sure that the record is correct. But that we need to do, not to avoid that the information is public in the first place.
If we have learned anything, is that actually secrecy is leading to more misinformation and disinformation than transparency. Yes, it is a risk to be transparent. You have to justify your conclusion. You have to explain why you reach a particular opinion. But in practice, it solves also a number of issues. And don't forget, again, we're working for patients. We're not working for the enemies of vaccine. We're working for patients who will benefit from those vaccines, and that should be the leading element.
But I agree that when your data are used, are misused, let's say, you should react. Because otherwise.
And we are doing, and we have done so in the past when we saw misinformation. Yes, we cannot react on everything, but we have done some time to rectify data. I think unfortunately we have to.
So I understand the clock is here for the moment, maybe later in the evening. And thank you both again to my speakers and to all those with questions. And I'll hand over to the next, I think is behind me.